Hey, grade 8s, welcome to lesson 2.3. Today's lesson, we are going to learn how increased trade led to powerful city-states in Italy. So stick around and let's learn something. Lesson 2.3. How did increased trade lead to the emergence of powerful city-states in Italy? Trade and the Renaissance and all of this, it started in the Italian city-states. Now, we need to remember that most countries back then did not have the same borders as today. And in fact, who knows, 20 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, definitely, the current borders that we have today probably are going to change for many, many countries. So, countries actually themselves didn't even really exist. Most of them were just kingdoms and empires, and they were ruled by monarchs. And Italy, as we know it, wasn't actually even a country, it was a collection of city states. And you saw this in your vocabulary. It was one of your vocabulary words. But a city state is consisting of a city that is politically independent and the rural area around it. This area that's around it, this rural area, is a hinterland. That's what it's called. So like the farmland that's around there. And Italian city states, they were extremely successful. They had a lot going for them. They were in the right place at the right time to become the wealthiest centers in all of Europe. They had four main things going for them, especially in northern Italy. They had fantastic geography, great climate, strong leadership, and they had a very well socially organized society. So let's take a look first at geography. If you take a look at this map of Italy, you can see that it's probably the closest to the port cities of northern Africa. Okay, it's a quick hop skip away on a ship, and you are in northern Africa. And the appeal of northern Africa was that, well, this is where a lot of the spices made their way, and there was a ton of other goods that could be traded here. And we saw this in the previous lesson. It's always cheapest to transport using a body of water. You can use the currents, you can use the winds and things like that. And you can put a lot of cargo onto a ship, and it's very easy to bring it from port to port. Much easier than going over land. Way easier. The second thing that Italy had going for it and its success for the city states was climate. Italy had a very mild climate, nice Mediterranean climate, which meant that trade and travel were not interrupted by winter. In November and December, January and February, even March, you know from experience that our travel here in Alberta is hindered by winter. It takes longer to go places. You're looking at road reports if you're heading outside of the city. You're paying attention to the weather and what's going to happen. And it takes a lot more planning. It slows a lot of people down, and sometimes the conditions are dangerous. Well, if you've got a mild climate, you don't need to worry about that kind of stuff. And that mild climate with it brings a longer growing season. So the Italians, they can grow their olives and they can grow their grapes. The olives they will use for cooking oil. And we know that Italians' cuisine is absolutely delicious, and it's world renowned. And they could grow grapes, and the grapes they would use to turn into wine. And both of these products are going to be in high demand throughout Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and all that kind of stuff, wherever those trade routes are. Number three, the third thing that the Italian city-states have going for it is strong leadership. Now, this is during a time where most of Europe is being ruled by a monarchy. Okay, the crown, the king or a queen has complete control. And these monarchies, these kingdoms, these empires, if you will, these are large areas of land. And the more land that you have, the more it's going to take for you to take care of, to defend, and to maintain. Well, for the Italian city states, they're going to be much smaller. And each Italian city state had its own government and had its own army. And physically, the size wise, area wise, because they're smaller, they're a lot easier to manage. And you can see I've highlighted four major Italian cities who became the most powerful. Genoa, Milan, Venice, and Florence became the most powerful of all of the city states that existed during this time. They were known for their trading, they were known for their banking, and this was a place where businesses wanted to be. Now, that small sense, that small area also played into having an excellent social organization. Feudalism didn't really exist in Italy, not the feudalism that we learned about in chapter 1. Instead, the nobles, instead of having land outside on a manor somewhere, like what we learned during the feudalist time of the rest of Europe in chapter 1, the nobles, they wanted to be right in town, right where the action was. And that's where they also spent their money. And if money is being spent in a town or a city, this is good news for the city. This is great news for the economy of the city and the people living there. And these nobles, because they had lots of money, they became involved in business, and then they became involved in politics. And this led to a very strong social organization and made for strong economic cities. And those four cities became very, very powerful. So Milan, Venice, Florence, Genoa, these cities became very powerful cities. But with power comes some sort of greed or competition or whatever you want. And competition definitely was something that was no stranger to the Italian city-states. There was a big rivalry for trade. Everybody wanted to control the trade routes. There was a ton of trade routes. There was a lot that they could have shared, but of course, this wasn't a time of sharing. This was a time for dominance. And Genoa and Venice, they wanted the complete control of the Mediterranean. Genoa and Venice both are major port cities, unlike Florence and Milan. So Genoa and Venice, they had all of these ships, thousands of ships that were on the Mediterranean during this time, and they were constantly fighting for each other or with each other. The thing that Venice really had going for it was that Venice is very easy to defend. Venice is a bottleneck. If you want to get into Venice, there is a bottleneck, and it's easy to defend a bottleneck because only so many ships can go in to the harbor at a time. And if you're going to attack Venice, you have to go through this bottleneck. So the Venetians had a very easy time to defend it. And Venice became a very important trading center to the Far East and Africa because of that. And I mentioned earlier that they had thousands of ships sailing on the Mediterranean. And they, like I said, for the Far East, for Africa, because Venice is on the east side of Italy, it just naturally lended itself to controlling the eastern routes of the trade. Genoa, on the other hand, was controlling the Spanish ports. And for, forever, it would seem like Genoa and Venice were equal in power. They were equal in trade. But it wasn't good enough for them. They needed to be the absolute best. So Genoa went to battle against Venice, and because of that bottleneck, then that easy defensive position that Venice holds, well, Genoa lost, and Genoa was never able to regain its power that it once had. So now Venice is going to be the powerful trading center of Europe because it is in Italy and it has access to all of these ports, now including the Spanish ports. And this opens up commerce in the city-states. Merchants became very wealthy. They made their money by buying goods in one place and upping the price in another place. So they would buy both finished and non-finished goods. So they would buy goods and resources, and they had their hands in everything. And this caused them to become very rich and very wealthy, and they started being kind of like the star of Europe. Everybody wanted to be a wealthy merchant. And we saw that in the new social structure from chapter 1, wealthy merchants are right up there. They are in the upper class. And bankers and merchants, so merchants got involved in banking to lend money, to give money out. They brought wealth to a particular city-state. And Florence was very powerful at this time. Florence had a lot of wealthy merchants living in the city, and they established one of the first banking houses in all of Europe. And the florin, so this was their currency, became the most important currency of all. And during this time, usury became an important practice. And what that is that's charging interest on loans. Somebody doesn't like this. The church doesn't like this. The church says that charging interest on a loan is sinful. But we're going to see that the church is eventually going to have to change its mind for the benefit of the economy and to push people forward and to move people forward. So their stance on that will eventually change, because they will then see the benefit to even the church itself by allowing interest to be collected by banks. And Florence, powerful Florence, so the church eventually, like I said, forgave this sin because it needed to encourage the investment of trade. The more trade you have, the more people are willing to give to the church. So it's win-win for the church, right? And so interest was now being allowed in the areas of trading voyages where shipwrecks or piracy would become an issue. If you are going to invest in a trading expedition, then we can charge you interest if there's a potential for a shipwreck or piracy. And eventually, because as money is being traded forward and backwards in every which way, new practices were being made to make trade even easier. You can see we've got a map here, and we have some of the major trade routes that are existing during this time. And Venice, you can see they have access, they are in blue, they have access to a number of ports, some major ports that they will use to then expand onto different land routes as well. So all throughout Europe, we've got these land routes that are also connected to Venice. So Venice becomes an extremely important center for trade. But back to Florence. Florence was the florin was the currency of choice. And although Venice had the major trade routes and they controlled all of that, Florence was known for its business and bankers. And like any other city-state, they competed with each other. And the Italian bankers, especially those from Florence, they traveled all over Europe. And they were, investing, and people were asking for loans and acquiring loans. And anybody who was exposed to one of these Italian bankers, they were super impressed by their business practices. Anybody who came into Florence, into Genoa, into Venice, they would be super impressed with how beautiful those cities were and how sophisticated those cities were. Remember, feudalism didn't exist. The nobles were living inside the cities. If the nobles are living inside the cities, they are going to spend all of their money, well, not all of their money, but a lot of their money on making sure that they have a nice place to live. They have a beautiful place to go out and hang out with friends, have coffee, talk about politics, talk about whatever's going on. And the people who came into these cities, they brought these ideas back with them to their own towns, to their own cities. And what they started to do is they started to replicate what was being seen in these major Italian city centers. And eventually, these values, these Italian values, they spread all across Europe. We mentioned some new practices that developed during this time, and these were practices that were introduced by the Italians. So some of the business practices that came about during this time of trade. First one we can see is partnerships and joint stock companies. The purpose of this is to used to raise money for large projects. So if something major is happening, maybe we're creating something, a building, let's say, instead of one person paying for this, a group of people would get together, and it means giving less money to the project, which reduces your risk should the project not be completed or should something happen to the project. So this became a very common practice among the wealthy Italians to build these major projects, or even to go on expeditions as well. They would all kind of chip in, and then this would reduce the overall risk. Banks, obviously, we talked about the Florentine banks. They provided money lending and issued bills of exchange. A bill of exchange is a modern day check. Okay, it's much safer to carry around a check than it is to, let's say, carry around gold. And even now, checks have been replaced because it's gotten even safer. You can carry your bank card. Now our phones have Tap and Apple Wallet and Amazon Pay, Google Pay, and all that kind of stuff. So even current practices are improving from old practices. And the fourth practice that the Italians were introducing was that of insurance. So if you're on if you're investing in a trading expedition, let's say, for example, you've got a number of goods, let's say you've got wine that you want to go and trade, you would pay a company to insure your goods. So you pay a small fee, okay? And if something happens to your goods that you've paid for this insurance, then, like, let's say if they got damaged, if they got lost, maybe they were robbed or whatever, there was a shipwreck, and down goes those goods. Well, the insurance company will then pay you for those goods. On the other hand, if your goods arrive safely at their destination, the insurance company keeps that insurance money. Just like car insurance, house insurance, you pay every month or you pay every year, however your families have it set up. And should something happen to your car, to your house, the insurance company will take care of you. If nothing happens, the insurance money gets to keep that money. Okay? So those are the four major business practices that were introduced during this time of trade. But the Black Death. Wait a second. Can't forget about the Black Death. This is all positive news that we are talking about here in Italy. Major trading centers, banking centers, areas of business, sophisticated cities. But obviously, the Black Death did not forget about Italy. It made its way into Europe through Italy. We saw that in the last chapter. And the Black Death killed in Europe, it killed half of the population. So it's safe to assume that half the population in Italy died as well, especially because the majority of the people, not the majority of the people, but a lot of people were living in these towns. So the economy was sent into a depression, and they did not recover until about the 1500s. But even during this time, merchants and bankers, they continued to grow wealthy because the Black Death didn't stop trade. COVID is not stopping trade either. We still desire goods. We still want goods. We still need goods. And so that still continued even during the Black Death. So even though there was a depression that was taking place, the merchants and the bankers still continued to grow wealthy. And I mentioned earlier that the rich people, they don't want to live amongst filth. They don't want to live amongst the dying. So they would take their money and they would invest it into their cities. They would spend money on the arts. They would spend money on cleaning up the city. They would spend money on architecture, anything to beautify the city, because they wanted to live in a beautiful place, in a clean place. And this made people loyal and prideful of their cities. Just like Edmonton with the Stantec Tower. At first, many people were against the creation of the Ice District for a lot of various reasons. But now that the Ice District is almost complete, there is a sense of civic pride that we have because of the Ice District and Stantec Tower being the second largest office building outside of Toronto. Like, it's big bragging rights for us, and it gives us a sense of civic pride. Just like sports will, so does architecture, which we just mentioned, the art scene, things like that. It's good for citizens. And when there's nice things to go out and enjoy, it makes us happy and loyal and prideful of our city. Now, there's one family who became very powerful, and that is the Medici family. Sometimes you'll hear it as the Medici family. I'm not sure which one is correct. I have heard it said both ways, even by Italians. I've heard it said both ways, Medici and or Medici. And they made their money through trading wool, or by trading wool. And they're from Florence, and they were extremely powerful from the 13th to the 17th century. They were involved everywhere. They were involved in the arts. They were involved in architecture. They were involved in banking. They were involved in religion. They had 3 popes come from the family. They loved to spend money on making sure that their cities are beautiful. And they made the Medici Bank, and at one point they were the most wealthy family in all of Europe at the time. Now think about that. There's millions of people that lived in Europe at this time. Millions upon millions, tens of millions of people. And this family was one of the richest families around. It was incredible how much money they actually had. And because of that, they developed as well some modern bookkeeping practices. So like the double entry and the general ledger to keep track of money. And those are practices that we still use today. But this family, because they were so powerful, they were also very, very twisted as well. So I'm going to give you some examples of this twistedness that took place over the course of about just less than 100 years. One of the family members in 1478, Giuliano, he was stabbed to death. So he came to a very gruesome death. In 1503, another member of the family, Piero the Unfortunate, and we wonder why he's named that, he drowned in a shipwreck. So, it's hitting this family pretty hard. 23 years later, in 1526, Giovanni della Berdenere was shot and killed while attacking the city-state of Mantua. Because remember, the city-states, they constantly were fighting with each other. There was this competition of trade. They wanted more hinterland so that they could grow their trading economies. A few years later, in 1535, Ippolito was poisoned by his own cousin. So now we're starting to see infighting within the Medici family, because the power is making this family do things that are not that wouldn't normally be seen. 2 years later, 1537, Alessandro Medici is assassinated by his cousin Lorenzo. And 10 years later, Lorenzo gets his assassination, or he becomes assassinated by the order of another cousin, Cosimo I. Okay? And then in 1576, another Medici, the daughter of Cosimo, Isabella, she's strangled by her husband. So she's strangled to death. So this power made the Medici family do some crazy things in order to maintain their power, and in order to increase their power. All right, I want you to head over to your notebook and complete the questions for this part of the chapter.